My name is Lillian, and for most of my life, I believed I knew my husband. Harold and I were married 52 years, long enough for habits to turn into landmarks. Tuesday mornings were one of those landmarks. Every Tuesday, without fail, Harold put on his brown jacket, the one with the loose button at the wrist, kissed my cheek, and said, "Back before lunch." He never rushed. He never explained. He never missed a Tuesday. Even when the snow piled high and the arthritis had him wincing, he went. "Bank day," he'd say, like it was a joke we'd been telling for decades. I never questioned it, not really. We came from a generation that didn't pick at the seams of marriage unless something was already torn. Trust wasn't something you negotiated, it was something you lived inside. Harold handled the finances, I handled the home. That's how it was, and for a long time, it worked. We weren't rich, but we were steady. The mortgage got paid, the lights stayed on, Christmas came every year. I raised our 2 children in that house with the blue shutters, believing that predictability was a form of love. The bank was on Main Street, 3 blocks past the bakery that always smelled like sugar and yeast. Sometimes Harold brought me a cinnamon roll on his way back. Sometimes he didn't. On Tuesdays, I timed my errands around his routine the way a tide schedules the shore. I remember once, early on, asking him what took so long. He smiled and said, "Paperwork, Lil." That was it, paperwork. The words slid into place and stayed there for 38 years. When Harold died, it wasn't sudden, it was slow and unkind, the kind of illness that gives you time to rehearse grief until you're exhausted. I sat by his bed for weeks, reading the paper aloud, rubbing lotion into his hands, listening to the shallow rhythm of the man I loved. In the last days, he spoke less. His eyes followed me like he wanted to say something and didn't know how. On the final Tuesday of his life, he didn't go to the bank. He slept. I noticed, but I told myself it meant nothing. I was wrong about that, too. After the funeral, after the casseroles and the sympathy cards and the quiet that settles into a house when it realizes it's lost its other heartbeat, I began the work of sorting. Drawers, closets, years. It's a strange thing touching the life someone built when they're no longer there to explain it. Every object becomes a question. Every envelope feels heavier than it should. That's when I found the folder. It was tucked behind the winter coats in the hall closet, wrapped in a grocery bag like it was something that might stain if it touched the light. The folder was thick, the kind with a string tie that had been opened and closed too many times. My name wasn't on it, neither was Harold's. There was just a small label written in his careful hand, Tuesdays. I stood there a long time, my arm aching from holding it, my mind rearranging memories like furniture. Tuesdays. The word hummed. I told myself not to open it. Harold had always been private, and grief makes you protective of boundaries that can no longer be enforced. But he was gone, and the folder was here, and something in me, the part that had learned to survive by knowing the truth, even when it hurt, pulled the string. Inside were bank statements, decades of them, deposits and withdrawals that didn't match our household accounts. A different branch, a different account number. There were notes in the margins, neat and consistent, like a ledger kept by someone who didn't want to forget why he started. Dates, amounts, initials I didn't recognize. And then there were letters. Not love letters, not confessions, just correspondence, typed, formal, between Harold and the bank manager. Safe deposit box renewals, authorization forms, instructions. 38 years of Tuesdays translated into paper. I sat on the floor and read until my legs went numb. My heart didn't race, it slowed. There's a kind of shock that feels like winter. Everything inside you goes still to preserve itself. I counted the years backward, marking our anniversaries against the statements. Our first grandchild's birth lined up with a larger deposit. The year we almost lost the house during a factory shutdown showed a withdrawal I never knew existed, money that had kept us afloat without my knowing how close we'd come to drowning. And then I found the key. It was taped to the inside of the folder, wrapped in yellowing plastic, the metal worn smooth. Safe deposit box key. The branch address was there too, the same Main Street bank, but a side entrance I had never used. I tried to breathe through it. I tried to tell myself this was all some benign precaution, a savings account, an inheritance plan, something thoughtful. But there were names I didn't know, initials that refused to resolve into family. That night, I lay in our bed alone and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. Harold had always fallen asleep before me. I used to watch his chest rise and fall and think, this is what safety looks like. I wondered if he'd been lying awake all those years, rehearsing what he'd never tell me. I wondered if love could be measured in what someone hides to protect you, or if that was just the story we tell ourselves when the truth is inconvenient. The next Tuesday, I went to the bank. I wore my coat and walked the 3 blocks past the bakery. The bell over the door chimed the same way it always had. The teller looked up and smiled, then hesitated. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly, like she'd practiced. I realized then how known Harold had been there, how visible his routine was to everyone but me. "I need to access a safe deposit box," I said, and slid the key across the counter. My hand shook. The manager came out, older now, but with the same careful eyes from the letters. He nodded at me with something like respect. "Of course, Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "We've been expecting you." That was the moment I froze, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because of what his words meant. They'd been waiting. Harold had prepared for my arrival. He had planned for the day I would finally learn why Tuesdays mattered more than I knew. The vault was cool and quiet. The manager set the box on the table and stepped away. "Take your time," he said. My fingers found the latch. For a second, I thought about leaving it closed, about walking back into the sunlight and choosing ignorance. But the truth has a gravity of its own. Once you're close enough, it pulls. Inside were more documents, birth certificates, deeds, a photograph of a young woman holding a baby, her eyes familiar in a way that made my chest ache. And on top of it all, a letter addressed to me, in Harold's hand, the ink pressed deep like he needed the paper to remember the weight of his decision. I didn't open it yet. I couldn't. I closed the box and told the manager I'd be back. Outside, the bakery smelled like cinnamon. The world went on. I stood there with the key in my pocket and realized that the life I thought I understood had been built on Tuesdays I never shared, and that whatever waited in that letter was going to ask me to reconsider what marriage and forgiveness really mean. I didn't open Harold's letter right away. I went home first, like a coward or a strategist. I still don't know which. I set the safe deposit box back in its brown envelope on the dining table where we used to do puzzles on Sunday afternoons. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath with me. I made tea I didn't drink. I washed a mug that was already clean. Grief does that. It gives you busy work to avoid the moment that will rearrange you. When I finally sat, the letter waited with a patience I envied. Harold's handwriting was steady, the way it always was, even near the end. He'd written my name the way he said it when we were alone, drawing the L like a promise. I told myself I could stop at any time. I told myself I could read one paragraph and rest. I told myself a lot of things. "My dearest Lillian," it began, and I heard his voice immediately, calm and careful, like he was choosing each word as if it could bruise me. "If you are reading this, then I have failed to tell you this myself. That failure is mine alone. I ask you to read everything before you judge me, because the truth, like love, is bigger than one moment. I pressed my thumb into the paper to keep it from trembling. He wrote about Tuesdays, about how 38 years ago a young woman named Rose walked into his office at the factory during lunch. He recognized her right away, he said, because she had his mother's eyes. She told him her story without drama. She was his half-sister, born after his father left town, raised by a woman who didn't ask for much except honesty. Rose wasn't asking for money, Harold wrote. She was asking for acknowledgement. I had to stop there. The word half-sister landed like a dropped plate, intact but ringing. I thought of Harold's father, a man who died before I met him, remembered only in black and white photos and cautious sentences. I thought of the way Harold had always gone quiet when family history came up, how he changed the subject with a joke. The letter went on. Rose had a child, a boy named Thomas. She worked 2 jobs and still came up short. Harold wrote that he saw in Thomas the shape of a responsibility he hadn't chosen but couldn't deny. He wrote about shame, not his sister's, but his father's, and how he decided that secrecy would be the least damaging path. He wrote, "I chose to protect you from a truth that would complicate our life," he wrote, "and I chose to honor a bloodline that existed whether I liked it or not." He explained the account, the deposits, the withdrawals. Tuesdays were the day he paid his father's debt without letting it spill into our marriage. He paid for Thomas's school clothes, his braces, a semester of community college, a used car that broke down 3 times before it stuck. He paid quietly, faithfully, without expecting gratitude. He wrote, "I did not tell you because I feared it would feel like a betrayal. I feared you would see the money as stolen from us. I feared you would see Rose as a ghost in our home." I read the sentence 3 times. Fear has a way of justifying itself until it looks like wisdom. I thought of the years I'd clipped coupons, the times we'd postponed vacations, the nights I'd lain awake doing math in my head that never included this invisible column. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to throw the letter across the room, but anger slid off me and left something heavier behind. Harold wrote about love and how it isn't always neat. He wrote that he loved me completely and believed that protecting my peace was part of that love. He wrote that he didn't regret helping Rose and Thomas, but he regretted not trusting me with the truth. He wrote, "I have carried this alone for so long that I forgot marriage is meant to carry weight together." At the end, he asked for forgiveness without demanding it. He asked me to meet Rose and Thomas if I could find it in my heart. He left addresses, phone numbers, names spelled carefully, like he was afraid I'd misread them and lose my way. He ended the letter with something that made me cry for the first time since the funeral. "You were my home, Lillian. Tuesdays were a debt. You were my life." I folded the letter and held it to my chest like a fragile thing. The photograph from the box came back to me, the woman with familiar eyes, the baby on her hip. Thomas, a nephew I never knew I had, a family stitched into my marriage without my consent. The next week passed like a test I hadn't studied for. Every memory felt re-edited. The year Thomas got braces lined up with a summer when we didn't replace the washing machine and used a laundromat instead. The semester of college matched the winter Harold insisted we skip gifts to keep it simple. Simple. I had believed him. I had believed in the goodness of small sacrifices without knowing who they fed. I called my daughter first. She listened without interrupting, a skill she'd learned from me. When I finished, she said, "Mom, he should have told you." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't soften the truth. Then she said, "But he also did something kind. Both can be true." I held on to that sentence like a railing. Meeting Rose took more courage than the bank vault ever did. We chose a diner halfway between our towns, neutral ground, with chipped mugs and forgiving booths. She recognized me immediately. I recognized her too, not because we looked alike, but because she wore nervousness like a coat she couldn't take off. "She never wanted to hurt you," she said before we'd even ordered. Her voice shook. "Harold told me about you. He loved you so much." There was no triumph in her eyes, no entitlement, just relief and regret braided together. We talked for hours. She told me about their father, the good and the bad, about the years she'd resisted help, then accepted it when pride became a luxury she couldn't afford. She told me how Harold never missed a Tuesday, how he'd sit across from her at the bank sometimes, silent but present, a brother learning how to be one late in life. She told me Thomas knew Harold as Uncle H, a man who showed up with practical gifts and fewer words. Thomas joined us later. He was grown, gentle, with a face that echoed Harold's when he smiled. He thanked me like I'd done something for him, and that broke me. I realized then that the anger I'd been waiting for wasn't coming. What came instead was grief. Grief for the honesty we'd missed, for the conversations that could have made our marriage truer, not weaker. On the walk home, I passed the bakery and bought a cinnamon roll. I ate it standing up, sugar on my fingers, thinking about how love can be generous and flawed at the same time. Harold's Tuesdays weren't an affair, they weren't a theft. They were a secret born of fear and loyalty, and they asked me a question I couldn't avoid. Could I forgive a good man for choosing solitude over trust? It took time. Forgiveness isn't a switch, it's a practice. I forgave him when I stopped replaying the what-ifs at night. I forgave him when I introduced Rose as family without explaining the whole story to strangers. I forgave him when I went back to the bank one last time, not to open a box, but to close the account, and felt a strange peace as the manager nodded, like we were finishing something together at last. Now, on Tuesdays, I walk past the bakery, and sometimes I go in, sometimes I don't. I've learned that routines can be both shelter and shadow. Harold taught me that love can hold secrets, but marriage should hold truth. I carry both lessons with me, careful and awake, no longer frozen, finally moving forward with eyes open. The quiet after truth is different from the quiet of grief. Grief is loud inside you, even when the house is still. Truth, once spoken, settles like dust after a long renovation. Things are changed, but you can finally see where the walls stand. In the weeks after meeting Rose and Thomas, I found myself relearning my own life, not by tearing it down, but by walking through it with a steadier step. I began to notice how many of my memories had been carrying extra weight without my knowing why. The times Harold seemed distant on Tuesday evenings, the way he would sometimes sit at the kitchen table after dinner, hands folded, staring at nothing. I had assumed it was work stress, or age, or the quiet burden men of his generation carried without complaint. Now I knew it had a name. Responsibility has a way of aging you faster than time. I found myself talking to Harold out loud, not in a dramatic way, just small conversations as I folded laundry or watered the plants. "You should have trusted me," I'd say, then pause, then add, "but I understand why you didn't." Understanding doesn't excuse, but it can soften the sharpest edges. Some nights I laughed at myself, realizing I was arguing with a man who could no longer interrupt me. Other nights I cried. Both felt honest. Our son, David, took longer to process the news. He was quieter than his sister, more methodical. When I finally told him about the letter and the account and the Tuesdays, he stared at his hands for a long time. "So," he said carefully, "there's a whole branch of our family we never knew." I nodded. He exhaled. Dad always said family was about showing up. He looked at me then, eyes wet. I guess he meant it. David wanted to meet Thomas right away. I worried it would be awkward, that resentment might sneak in wearing politeness. Instead, it was gentle. They talked about work and music and the strange way people can resemble one another without sharing a childhood. When they shook hands goodbye, something eased in my chest. Secrets can fracture families, but truth, handled carefully, can also widen them. I went back through the safe deposit box one last time, not because I needed more answers, but because I wanted to finish what Harold started. There were smaller things I hadn't noticed before: receipts for shoes, a program from a high school graduation, a note Thomas had written at 16 that said, "Thank you for not giving up on us." I folded that note and put it in my purse. Some gratitude doesn't belong in a vault. The bank manager asked if I wanted copies of the old statements. I shook my head. "No," I said, "I don't need proof anymore." He smiled like someone who had watched a long story come to an end. "Your husband was a good man," he said. I nodded. "He was," I replied. Both things were true. Life didn't suddenly become easier. There were still bills and aches and lonely mornings, but something shifted. I stopped flinching when Tuesday came around. I started volunteering at the library on that day, shelving books and talking to strangers who didn't know my history and didn't need to. I learned that you can reclaim a day without erasing its past. One afternoon, Rose came by the house. She brought a pie she'd baked herself, the crust uneven and proud. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Harold and I had planned our children's futures. "I wish he'd told you," she said quietly. I nodded. "So do I." We let the wish sit between us, not to accuse him, but to honor the cost of his silence. Before she left, she touched the back of a chair and said, "He loved this place." I believed her. Thomas wrote me a letter a month later. He said he didn't expect anything from me, that he understood if this new connection felt overwhelming. He thanked me for meeting him anyway. He ended by saying he hoped I'd come to his wedding in the spring. I held the invitation in my hands and felt something like joy edge its way into grief. Life, it seemed, was still inviting me forward. On the morning of what would have been our 53rd anniversary, I woke early and made coffee for one. I sat by the window and watched the light move across the floor. I thought about marriage not as a ledger of right and wrong, but as a long conversation. Harold missed a crucial sentence. I missed the chance to hear it. We were both human. That realization didn't diminish our love, it clarified it. I decided then to write my own letter, not to Harold, but to myself. I wrote about the danger of equating peace with silence. I wrote about the courage it takes to invite truth into love. I wrote about forgiveness as an active choice, not a passive forgetting. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the folder labeled Tuesdays, then put the folder in a drawer I could open without fear. At Thomas's wedding, I sat in the second row with Rose. When he smiled at his bride, I saw Harold smile and felt a swell of pride that surprised me. Family, I realized, is less about origin than obligation, the obligations we choose to honor even when they're inconvenient, even when they scare us. Harold honored his in secret. I would honor mine in the open. After the ceremony, a woman I didn't know hugged me and said, "You must be so proud." I was, not because everything had been perfect, but because it had been faced. Pride, I learned, can survive disappointment. Love, too. Now, when people ask me what I miss most about my husband, I don't say Tuesdays. I say his steadiness, his quiet way of showing up. And when they ask me what I learned after he died, I tell them this: love doesn't end when the truth arrives. It changes. If you let it, it grows wiser. I keep the safe deposit box key in a small bowl by the door. It doesn't open anything anymore. It reminds me that secrets have weight, and so does trust, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do for the people you love is let them know the whole of you before Tuesdays turn into years and years turn into silence. Grief has seasons, and so does forgiveness. I learned that in the months that followed as life tested whether my understanding was sturdy or just polite. It's easy to forgive in theory, harder when memory ambushes you in the cereal aisle or when a bill arrives stamped with a date that lands on a Tuesday. Those were the moments I discovered forgiveness isn't a feeling you achieve once and keep. It's a muscle you use until it stops hurting so much. Spring came early that year. The blue shutters needed paint, and for the first time I hired someone to do it. Harold had always insisted on doing those jobs himself, ladder wobbling, paint in his hair. Standing in the yard, watching someone else tend to the house, I felt the strange relief of letting go of a role I hadn't realized I'd been clinging to. Change, I was learning, didn't always mean loss. Sometimes it meant rest. One Tuesday, while the painter worked, I found myself telling a neighbor about Harold's bank routine. Not the whole story, just the shape of it. She laughed softly and said, "Men and their mysteries." I smiled, but later I wished I'd said more, not to expose Harold, but to normalize the truth that good people can make choices that complicate love. Silence had kept me safe for years. Now it felt like a habit I didn't need anymore. I began sorting through our old photo albums, the kind with plastic sleeves that stick to your fingers. There we were, young and hopeful, hair darker, smiles easier. There were Tuesdays in those photos, too, pictures taken on days I hadn't marked, days Harold had carried his secret into frame and stood beside me anyway. I didn't see deceit in his eyes. I saw concentration, resolve. It softened me again, and I let it. Rose called more often. We talked about ordinary things, recipes, weather, aches. The extraordinary had settled into the background where it belonged. She told me about her childhood, the way she'd learned early not to expect permanence. I told her about mine, the stability I'd taken for granted. We weren't trying to balance scales. We were building a bridge. David asked me one evening if I'd ever suspected an affair. The question was careful, but it landed. I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "not like that." I told him trust is often invisible. You only see it when it breaks or when you realize how much weight it's been holding. He nodded. "I want to do better," he said. I knew what he meant, and I was grateful the lesson didn't have to wait for his own loss. The library became a refuge. I shelved biographies and noticed how many lives are defined by a single decision made quietly. The patrons didn't know me, and that anonymity felt like permission to be exactly who I was that day: sad, steady, curious, tired. On Tuesdays, I lingered longer, letting the day pass without ceremony. One afternoon, a woman about my age asked me for help finding a book on marriage. I handed her a memoir and surprised myself by saying, "Read it slowly." She smiled, not knowing why that mattered. Maybe none of us do until it does. As summer warmed the house, I invited Rose and Thomas for dinner. I cooked Harold's favorite roast, not as a tribute, but as a continuation. At the table, stories overlapped and laughter found its way in. Thomas talked about his plans, his hopes. Rose teased him the way sisters do, and I felt the family shape expand, not replace what was lost, but include it. After they left, I washed dishes and realized I hadn't thought about the bank once that day. Healing doesn't announce itself. It slips in while you're busy living. On the anniversary of Harold's death, I went to the cemetery alone. I told him about the wedding, the library, the blue shutters. I told him I was okay. I didn't ask why he hadn't told me sooner. That question had lost its power. In its place was a quieter understanding. We all do the best we can with the tools we have at the time. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a young couple arguing softly near the gate, their hands still linked despite the tension. I wanted to stop them, to say something wise and gentle about truth and courage. I didn't. Wisdom, I've learned, can be shared best through example, not interruption. At home, I opened the drawer with the folder one last time. I took out the key and placed it in a small frame, not as a relic, but as a reminder. The folder stayed, but it no longer owned the day. I did. If there's a moral to this story, it's not that secrets are always wrong or that love must be perfect to endure. It's that trust deserves the dignity of honesty, and forgiveness deserves the time it takes to become real. Harold and I didn't get everything right, but we loved earnestly, and that counts for something. I still pass the bakery on Tuesdays. Sometimes I go in and buy a cinnamon roll. Sometimes I keep walking. Either way, I'm not frozen anymore. I'm moving, choosing, living, carrying the full truth of my life with a steadier heart and an open hand. By the time autumn arrived, the story of Tuesdays had settled into me the way weather settles into bones. Not painful exactly, just present. I noticed it most when the air turned sharp and the leaves began to collect along the curb the same way they always had. Harold used to kick them aside on his walks, grumbling about gutters. I found myself doing the same, smiling at the muscle memory of a shared life. I started writing again, something I hadn't done seriously since my 30s. Back then, it had been grocery lists and notes for school lunches. Now, it was reflections, short paragraphs about ordinary days that carried quiet meaning. I wrote about the dignity of routine and the danger of mistaking consistency for transparency. I wrote about how love can be generous and flawed without canceling itself out. Writing became a way of listening to my own thoughts without interrupting them. One Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived addressed in a hand I didn't recognize. It was from Thomas's mother-in-law, thanking me for coming to the wedding and for welcoming Thomas so fully. The phrase startled me. Fully. I hadn't realized that's what I was doing, choosing inclusion over suspicion, presence over resentment. I folded the letter and placed it with the others that mattered. Rose and I began meeting weekly, not always on Tuesdays, but often enough that the day lost its singular power. We shared stories of Harold that overlapped and diverged, creating a fuller picture than either of us had alone. She told me about the time he'd taught Thomas to change a tire in a grocery store parking lot, refusing help from strangers. I told her about the night he stayed up repairing a toy for our daughter because tomorrow matters to kids. We laughed at the sameness of him across two lives. There were moments when the old anger tried to resurface. It usually arrived dressed as practicality, when I reviewed finances or faced a repair we could have afforded sooner. In those moments, I let myself feel it without judgment. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending harm didn't exist. It means deciding not to let it be the loudest voice in the room. At the library, a young man asked me once why biographies always seemed sad. I told him they weren't sad. They were honest. People live, I said, and living leaves marks. He considered that, then thanked me like I'd given him something useful. Maybe I had. David invited me to stay with his family for Thanksgiving. At the table, surrounded by noise and movement, I felt the familiar ache of absence and the surprising comfort of expansion. Rose and Thomas were there too, tentative at first, then woven in by shared dishes and passing bread. When someone proposed a toast, David raised his glass and said, "To family, found and given." I blinked back tears and drank to that. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the guest room and thought about how close Harold had come to never being known fully, not just by me, but by himself. Secrets have a way of shrinking us. Truth, even late, can stretch a life wider than it ever was. December brought snow and the familiar pull of memory. I decorated the house simply, resisting the urge to preserve it exactly as it had been. Change, I reminded myself, wasn't betrayal. On Christmas morning, I opened a small box David had wrapped carefully. Inside was a notebook, leather-bound. On the first page he'd written, "For your Tuesdays." I laughed and cried at once. The year turned. On the anniversary of my first visit to the bank alone, I walked past it without stopping. I realized then that the building no longer held the story. It lived in me, transformed. I had carried it, examined it, learned from it, and set it down where it belonged. If you're listening to this and carrying a secret, yours or someone else's, I hope you hear this gently. Truth told in love may hurt, but truth withheld can hollow a life. And if you're carrying the aftermath of a truth revealed too late, know this: you are allowed to feel more than one thing. Love doesn't vanish because it was imperfect. Sometimes it deepens because it was. I still miss Harold. I always will. But I no longer measure our marriage by what he didn't tell me. I measure it by how we showed up again and again, even when we were afraid. And on Tuesdays, when the world feels ordinary and charged all at once, I take a breath and keep going, awake, forgiving, and fully alive. Time has a way of testing the stories we tell ourselves. It presses on them quietly, seeing which parts hold and which were only borrowed to get us through a season. By the second year after Harold's death, I knew which parts of my understanding were sturdy. The anger no longer surprised me when it appeared, and the tenderness no longer felt fragile. Both had earned their place. I sold the house in early spring, not because I needed to, but because I was ready. The blue shutters had faded again, and instead of repainting them, I took it as a sign. Packing was slower than I expected. Every drawer seemed to ask a question. Every object carried a small echo of Tuesdays past. Receipts tucked into books, a pen Harold favored resting in a cup by the phone. I didn't rush. Letting go deserved its own pace. On moving day, Rose came by to help. She wrapped dishes with care, the way someone does when they know breakage matters. We worked mostly in silence, companionable and steady. At one point, she held up Harold's brown jacket, the one with the loose button, and asked, "Do you want to keep this?" I took it from her and pressed my face into the fabric. "Yes," I said, "for now." The new apartment was smaller, brighter, closer to the library. On my first Tuesday there, I woke without the familiar pull toward Main Street. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching people hurry past with their own routines. It occurred to me that most lives are built around rituals no one else notices. We're all keeping Tuesdays of one kind or another. Thomas visited that summer. We walked the neighborhood and talked about work and the future. He asked me about Harold, not the secret parts, but the ordinary ones. I told him about the way Harold hummed when he fixed things, how he pretended not to care about birds but filled the feeder anyway. Thomas listened like he was memorizing something precious. "I wish I'd known him longer," he said. I nodded. "Me too," I replied, meaning it in a new way. One evening, as we sat on my small balcony, Thomas asked if I ever wished Harold had chosen differently. The question was careful, generous. I thought about it honestly. "I wish he'd trusted me sooner," I said, "but I don't wish away the good that came from his choice." Regret and gratitude can share the same sentence. It took me a long time to learn that. The notebook David gave me began to fill, not with complaints or confessions, but with moments. A woman laughing on the bus, a child tying his shoe with fierce concentration, the relief of saying no when I meant no. Writing became less about processing pain and more about honoring presence. Tuesdays appeared often, but they no longer dominated the page. At the library, I was asked to lead a small discussion group. We read memoirs and talked about truth, how it's shaped by fear and love and timing. People shared more than I expected. A man admitted he'd kept a secret savings account his wife didn't know about. A woman confessed she'd hidden an illness until it was impossible to ignore. I didn't judge. I listened. When it was my turn, I spoke carefully, not about the bank or the box, but about what happens when silence outlives its usefulness. Afterward, a young woman stayed behind. "I think I need to tell my partner something," she said, eyes bright with worry. I squeezed her hand. Be kind and be brave. Advice is easier to give when it's been paid for. On the 3rd anniversary of Harold's death, I went back to the bakery. I ordered a cinnamon roll and sat at a small table by the window. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. I tasted sugar and memory and something like peace. When I left, I tipped extra and thanked the cashier for no particular reason. Gratitude, I found, doesn't need a cause. I donated the safe deposit box key to a small art exhibit at the library, a collection of objects that represented turning points. The card beside it read, "A reminder that love and truth grow best together." I watched people read it, some nodding, some frowning, all thinking their own thoughts. The key had finally found its purpose. As years move on, the story becomes simpler, not because details fade, but because meaning clarifies. Harold was a good man who made a fearful choice. I was a loving wife who deserved the truth. We were both shaped by our time and our limits. The lesson I carry now is this: secrecy may feel like protection, but trust is the greater kindness. I still mark Tuesdays, but softly, sometimes with a walk, sometimes with a phone call to Rose, sometimes with nothing at all. Freedom, I've learned, includes the freedom not to be ruled by a day. If you're listening and wondering whether it's too late to tell the truth, I hope you hear this clearly. Late is better than never, and courage grows with use. And if you're the one receiving a truth that arrives after years of silence, know that you are allowed to take your time. Healing honors no calendar. I am older now, steadier, less afraid of complexity. My life is quieter, but it is full. And when I think of Harold, of Tuesdays and banks and letters and love, I no longer freeze. I remember, I forgive, and I keep living. There is a moment, somewhere between remembering and forgetting, when a story stops being heavy and starts being useful. I didn't notice exactly when that happened with mine. There was no ceremony, no final tear, just a quiet morning when I realized I was telling the story of Harold and the Tuesdays without my voice tightening, without my body bracing for impact. The truth had finally settled into wisdom. I was invited to speak at the library's annual community night, a small gathering where people shared experiences that had shaped them. I hesitated before agreeing. My life had never been loud, but something in me knew that silence had already had enough years. When my turn came, I stood behind the lectern and looked out at familiar faces. Neighbors, retirees, young couples holding hands like anchors. I didn't tell every detail. I spoke about marriage as a long education. I spoke about fear disguising itself as protection. I spoke about the cost of secrets, not in money or time, but in distance. When I finished, there was no applause at first, just quiet. Then someone began to clap slowly, and others followed. A man in the front row wiped his eyes. Afterward, people came up to me with confessions disguised as thank yous. I listened. That night, I slept deeply. Rose and I took a short trip together that summer. Nothing grand, just a coastal town with benches facing the water. We walked slowly, the way women do when they've learned not to rush what remains. One afternoon, she said, "I used to think Harold was brave." She paused. "Now I think he was human." I smiled. Me too. There was relief in that agreement. Bravery can be lonely. Humanity invites company. We talked about our futures without centering them around Harold. That felt important. Love should leave room for what comes next, even when what comes next is simply more living. Rose spoke about moving closer to Thomas. I spoke about a writing class I was considering. We made plans that didn't require the past's permission. On a Tuesday in late September, I received an email from a woman who'd attended the community night. She wrote that she'd told her husband about a secret debt she'd been hiding for years. "It was awful," she wrote. And then it wasn't. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Awful and then not. That's how truth often works. My own days became gentler. I woke early, walked when the weather allowed, read until my eyes tired. I noticed small mercies, the kindness of a bus driver, the steadiness of my breath, the comfort of knowing I no longer had to protect anyone from myself. There's a particular freedom in not managing appearances anymore. At Thanksgiving, our expanded family gathered again. This time there was no awkwardness, just stories layered on stories, children darting between legs, the clatter of dishes. Thomas asked me to teach him Harold's way of carving the turkey, precise, patient, reverent. As I guided his hands, I felt something pass between generations, not blood exactly, but intention. That mattered more. Later that evening, David sat beside me on the couch. "Dad," he said, "I think Mom would be proud of you." I laughed softly. "I hope so," I replied. Then I corrected myself. "Actually, I know so. Love, once real, doesn't need speculation." Winter came, quiet and white. On particularly cold Tuesdays, I stayed in and wrote. The notebook filled with reflections that felt less like healing and more like testimony. I wasn't writing to explain myself anymore. I was writing to witness a life that had grown larger by facing its truth. I thought often about the people who never open the folder, who sense something is there and choose to leave it untouched. I don't judge them. Fear is persuasive. But I wish them courage, because on the other side of truth, there is not destruction as we imagine, but clarity, and clarity is a form of peace. On the 5th anniversary of Harold's death, I visited the cemetery again. I didn't bring flowers. I brought words. I told him about the speaking, the writing, the way our story had helped others loosen their own knots. "You taught me something in the end," I said aloud, "not by hiding, but by what your hiding revealed." The wind moved through the trees like a response. As I walked back, I realized I no longer needed to ask whether I'd forgiven him. Forgiveness had already proven itself in my living. It showed up in my openness, my patience, my refusal to let fear run the house. Forgiveness, I learned, is visible in the choices you make afterward. If you are listening to this story and holding a truth you're afraid to tell, I won't tell you it will be easy. It won't. But I will tell you this. Secrets demand a lifetime of maintenance. Truth asks for courage once, then gives you back your days. And if you are like me, someone who learned the truth too late, know that your life is not reduced by what you didn't know now. It can be expanded by what you choose to do with the knowing now. Tuesdays still come. They always will. But they no longer arrive carrying weight. They arrive like any other day, full of possibility, shaped by choice. And when they pass, I let them go, grateful for the life that taught me how. A story doesn't really end when you stop telling it. It settles into the background of your days, influencing your choices in ways so small you almost miss them. By the time I reached my 78th birthday, I realized the story of Harold and the Tuesdays had become less about him and more about who I had learned to be because of him. I celebrated that birthday quietly, with a slice of cake from the bakery and a phone call from each of the kids. Rose sent flowers. Thomas sent a book with a note tucked inside that read, "For the woman who taught me what grace looks like." I sat at my small kitchen table and let the gratitude wash over me without trying to earn it. That was new. I began mentoring at the library, helping people organize their personal histories, letters, journals, photographs. It was practical work, but emotional too. People would come in with boxes and leave with folders, relieved to see their lives take shape. Sometimes they shared stories, sometimes they didn't. Either way, I learned how hungry people are to be understood, even by themselves. One afternoon, a man in his 60s brought in a box labeled bank. He laughed nervously when he saw my face. "Funny coincidence," he said. I smiled and helped him sort. He didn't tell me what it meant, but when he left, he shook my hand a little longer than necessary. I knew that grip. It belonged to someone standing at the edge of truth. Rose's health began to falter that year. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of years. I drove her to appointments and sat beside her with magazines neither of us read. We talked about Harold less and less, not because he mattered less, but because he was finally at rest between us. Our relationship no longer needed him as context. We had become family in our own right. On a Tuesday in early spring, Rose looked at me and said, "You know, I think he worried you'd leave if you knew." The sentence hung in the air. I considered it carefully. "I think he worried I'd see him differently," I replied, "and I would have." She nodded. "But you still loved him." I smiled. "Yes," I said, "I still loved him." Love, I had learned, isn't fragile. It adapts. That summer, I took the writing class I'd been circling for years. The instructor asked us to write about a turning point. I chose a small one, the moment I held the safe deposit key in my hand outside the bank and decided to walk inside. When I read it aloud, my voice steady, the room was quiet in that familiar way. After class, a woman approached me and said, "Thank you for not making it tidy." I took that as the highest compliment. The seasons continued their patient rotation. I hosted fewer dinners, traveled less, but felt no smaller for it. In fact, my world felt more intentional. I said yes when it mattered and no when it didn't. I stopped apologizing for my pace. Aging, I discovered, can be a form of honesty if you let it. At Thanksgiving, Thomas announced his wife was pregnant. The room erupted. I sat back and watched the joy ripple outward, imagining a child who would grow up knowing the full shape of their family. No folders, no vaults, just stories told as needed with care. That felt like progress. That night, after the dishes were done, I stepped outside into the cold and looked up at the sky. I thought about legacy, not money or property, but patterns. Harold had broken one pattern by acknowledging his sister. I had broken another by refusing to let secrecy define my marriage after his death. Change, I realized, doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth a little sooner than the generation before you. On what would have been Harold's 82nd birthday, I lit a candle and read aloud from my notebook. I told him about the mentoring, the class, the coming baby. I told him I was proud of the life we built and the one that kept growing afterward. There was no ache in my chest this time, just warmth. If there's one thing I wish people understood about forgiveness, it's this. It doesn't erase the past. It rearranges the future. It gives you room to move, to breathe, to choose differently when the chance comes again. Tuesdays still arrive, gentle and unremarkable. Some weeks I don't even notice them. Some weeks I do, and I smile. A day that once held a secret now holds a lesson, and lessons, when learned, don't need to hurt anymore. I am not the woman I was before the folder, before the key, before the freeze. I am steadier, kinder, and braver in quiet ways. And if this story reaches you at a moment when you're standing outside a door you're afraid to open, I hope you remember this. On the other side of truth, there is life waiting for you to step in. As the years stacked themselves gently behind me, I noticed how memory changed its posture. It no longer leaned forward, demanding attention. It sat beside me instead, companionable, like someone who knows when to speak and when to let silence do the work. The story of Harold and the Tuesdays had found its proper place, not erased, not exalted, just integrated. Thomas's child was born on a Tuesday morning. Rose called me before sunrise, her voice bright with a joy that trembled. "A girl," she said. "They named her Lily." I sat on the edge of my bed and laughed softly at the coincidence, at the tenderness of being folded into the future in a way I hadn't expected. When I held that baby weeks later, her small hand wrapped around my finger with a certainty that felt like instruction. "This is what continues," her grip seemed to say. Love carried forward. At the baby's naming ceremony, someone introduced me as Great Aunt Lillian. The title startled me, then settled. Names matter. They locate us. I realized that Harold's fear had been about names, too. What would change if the truth were spoken aloud? In the end, what changed was not love, but its reach. My writing took on a new rhythm. I began to shape the reflections into longer pieces, not for publication, but for preservation. I wanted the family to have a record that didn't smooth the edges or dramatize the pain, just the facts warmed by understanding. I wrote about the bank and the bakery, the letter and the key, the way shock can feel like ice and forgiveness like thaw. I wrote so no one would have to guess what silence costs. One afternoon at the library, a teenager asked me why old people tell stories that take so long to get to the point. I smiled. "Because the point," I said, "is rarely the moment itself. It's everything that led there." He nodded like he wasn't sure he believed me yet. That was fine. Some lessons wait for time. Harold passed away quietly the following winter. I sat with her the night before, holding her hand, the room dim and kind. "Take care of Lily," she whispered. I promised I would. When she was gone, I felt the old grief rise, familiar but different. Loss had taught me how to hold it without being swallowed. At her memorial, Thomas hugged me and said, "You're my family." There was no hesitation, no explanation, just truth spoken in time. On the drive home, I passed the old bank building. It had been renovated, the side entrance closed off. I pulled over and sat for a moment, watching people come and go through new doors. The place where secrets had been kept was now a cafe. I laughed at the poetry of it. Spaces change, so do we. I thought about how close Harold came to carrying his burden into the grave without a word, how close I came to never knowing the fuller shape of my own marriage. The difference had been a letter, a key, a Tuesday that finally broke its pattern. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. I spent more time with my grandchildren, telling them stories without protecting them from complexity. Not the heavy parts, but the honest ones. I told them that people can love each other deeply and still make mistakes, that doing the right thing can be harder than doing the easy thing, that forgiveness is a choice you make again and again, not a feeling you wait for. On my 80th birthday, David gave me a small frame. Inside was a copy of the letter Harold had written me, preserved and clear. "So it doesn't get lost," he said. I placed it on my shelf beside photos old and new. The past didn't threaten the present anymore. It informed it. If you've listened this far, I want to say something plainly, without poetry or pause. Secrets don't just belong to the person who keeps them. They shape everyone nearby. And truth, even when it arrives late and trembling, can still do good work. My life is quieter now. My steps are slower, but my heart is unburdened in a way it never was before. Tuesdays come and go, and when they do, I notice the light, the ordinary grace of a day that no longer asks me to freeze. I loved a man who went to the bank every Tuesday for 38 years. I loved him before I knew why. I loved him after I found out. And in loving him through the truth, I learned how to live the rest of my days awake. By the time I reached my 81st year, life had become less about adding and more about tending to relationships, to memories, to the quiet understanding that days are not guaranteed, but they are generous if you pay attention. The story of Harold and the Tuesdays no longer arrived as a lesson I had to rehearse. It had become part of how I moved through the world, lighter, but no less true. Lily began to walk that year. I watched her wobble across the living room, arms out like she was greeting the air itself. When she fell, she laughed, surprised by gravity, but not afraid of it. I thought about how fear is taught, not born, how secrecy can teach it without ever meaning to. I promised myself I would be honest with her when the time came, not burdening, not dramatic, just truthful. Children can carry more truth than we give them credit for, especially when it's offered with care. My writing group encouraged me to submit one of my essays to a local paper. I resisted at first. The story felt too personal, too ordinary. Then I realized that was exactly why it mattered. When the piece was published, letters arrived from people I'd never met. Some thanked me, some argued. One man wrote that he'd gone to the bank every Thursday for years and hadn't known how to stop. I sat with his letter for a long time, hoping he'd find his way. I began speaking less and listening more. There's a clarity that comes with age. You stop needing to be right and start wanting to be present. When friends confided their own secrets, I didn't rush them toward confession or absolution. I asked gentle questions. I shared my story when it helped, not when it impressed. Wisdom, I learned, is mostly restraint. On a quiet Tuesday in April, I visited the cemetery again. I brought no flowers, no speeches. I sat on the bench and watched birds argue over crumbs. I told Harold about Lily's first steps, about the article, about Rose. I told him I forgave him, not as a declaration, but as a fact already lived. The wind moved the branches above me, and I felt complete. That summer, I downsized again, this time to make room for visits. My door stayed open, the house filled with laughter and the small chaos of family. No one tiptoed around the past. It was there, acknowledged, no longer dangerous. I noticed how ease grows when nothing has to be hidden. As the year turned, I reflected on the question people often asked me now. Would you want to know if you were in my place? My answer never changed. Yes, I said, but I'd want it told with kindness. Truth without kindness is cruelty. Kindness without truth is avoidance. Love lives in the balance. On the last Tuesday of the year, I baked cinnamon rolls from scratch. The kitchen smelled like memory and choice. I shared them with neighbors, with the mail carrier, with anyone who knocked. That day no longer belonged to the past. I had reclaimed it, not by forgetting, but by transforming it. If there is an ending to this story, it is not death or discovery. It is this. I learned that love is not proven by how well we hide our flaws, but by how bravely we invite others into them. Harold loved me the best way he knew how. I loved him enough to forgive the way he failed. And in that exchange, imperfect and human, a life found its truest shape. I don't know how many Tuesdays I have left. None of us do. But I know this. I will meet them awake, honest, and unafraid. That is the inheritance I carry forward and the one I leave behind. There comes a point in life when you stop asking what might have been and start asking what still is. I reached that point quietly, without announcement, on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the light came in soft through the curtains and I realized I was content. Not happy in the loud sense, not triumphant, just settled. The kind of peace that doesn't need witnesses. I moved slower now. My hands weren't as steady, but my mind felt clearer than it ever had. The urgency that once followed me, the need to understand everything, to resolve every loose end, had loosened its grip. I had learned that some truths don't arrive to be solved, they arrive to be carried with grace. Lily grew quickly. She learned words and then opinions. When she asked questions, I answered them honestly, scaled to her years. When she asked about her great-uncle Harold, I told her he was a good man who loved his family and sometimes made hard choices. That was enough. One day, when she is older, I will tell her more. Truth, I've learned, is not a single event. It's a conversation that unfolds when the listener is ready. I kept writing, though less often. When I did, it was to remember, not because I was afraid of forgetting, but because memory deserves tending. I wrote one last entry about the bank, not as a place of secrecy, but as a symbol of how easily routines can become hiding places. I ended it with a sentence that surprised me. We are all capable of more honesty than we think. I closed the notebook and felt finished. On my 83rd birthday, my family gathered again. The table was fuller than it had ever been. Children spilled juice, someone burned the rolls. We laughed anyway. At one point, Thomas raised his glass and said, "To Lillian, who taught us that truth doesn't break families, silence does." I felt heat rise to my cheeks and let it. Some things are meant to be received. That night, after everyone left, I stood at the sink and washed the last plate. The house was quiet, but not empty. I thought about Harold, not with longing, not with anger, but with a steady affection that felt earned. I spoke to him aloud, thanking him for the life we shared and for the lesson he never meant to teach me but did. The next Tuesday, I walked past the bakery and didn't go in. I kept walking, enjoying the cool air, my breath visible and calm. The day didn't demand anything from me. It simply unfolded. If this story has stayed with you, if you've listened through the turns and pauses and silences, then maybe it has touched something familiar. Maybe you too have a Tuesday, a routine, a question you've avoided, or a truth that arrived late and left you standing still. If so, I want you to know this: freezing is human. Staying frozen is not required. Love can survive the truth. Families can expand around it. A life can grow wiser even in its later chapters. I am proof of that. Not because I did everything right, but because I chose eventually to live awake. My husband went to the bank every Tuesday for 38 years. When he died, I learned why, and for a moment I froze. Then I breathed, then I opened my life wider than it had ever been before. And that, more than any secret or revelation, is the story I leave with you. There is a stillness that comes at the very end of a long understanding. It's not the stillness of emptiness, but of completion, the way a lake settles after a stone has finally sunk to the bottom. I reached that stillness without noticing the exact moment it arrived. One day, I simply realized I was no longer bracing myself when I thought of Harold. I was remembering him the way you remember something solid and finished, like a well-built house you once lived in and loved. My days became smaller, but richer. I learned the geography of my neighborhood by heart, the crack in the sidewalk near the corner, the tree that bloomed earlier than the rest, the bench that always caught the afternoon sun. I no longer hurried. There was nowhere I needed to outrun. Time, once an enemy, had become a companion who walked beside me instead of ahead. Lily grew into her questions. Children always do. One afternoon, while we sat coloring at the table, she looked up and asked, "Why do you get quiet on Tuesdays sometimes?" I didn't freeze. I smiled, surprised by my own ease. "Because Tuesdays remind me of someone I loved very much," I said. She nodded, satisfied. "Love makes people quiet," she decided, and went back to her crayons. Wisdom arrives early when truth isn't hidden. As my body slowed, my mind stayed alert, attentive to the way life continues whether we cling or not. I began giving away small things, books I had finished, sweaters I no longer needed, objects that had served their purpose. Letting go felt different now. It wasn't loss, it was circulation, love moving from one set of hands to another. One Tuesday morning, I woke from a dream of Harold standing at the bakery counter, tapping exact change onto the glass. He turned and smiled, not apologetic, not secretive, just present. When I woke, I didn't ache. I felt grateful. Dreams, like truth, sometimes arrive late but still do their work. I organized my papers one final time, careful and thorough. Among them was the letter Harold had written me all those years ago, the one that had frozen me in place and then slowly taught me how to move again. I placed it in an envelope labeled simply History and added a note of my own. Read with kindness. Some truths need guidance even after they're told. On my last visit to the library as a volunteer, the staff threw me a small farewell. There was cake and awkward speeches and more emotion than I expected. One woman hugged me and said, "You taught us to listen." I thought about that on the walk home. Listening had changed my life more than any speaking ever did. That afternoon, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched a young couple argue gently on the sidewalk below. They stopped, talked, laughed, and walked on together. I whispered a small prayer for them, that they would choose honesty sooner than fear and courage sooner than comfort. It felt like passing something forward. When my time came to rest more than I moved, I did not resist it. I had learned that resisting only hardens what should soften. I spoke openly with my family about my wishes, my memories, my gratitude. Nothing important was left unsaid. Silence, once such a powerful presence in my life, no longer held any authority. On my final Tuesday, I noticed the light again, the way it always came in slantwise in the morning, generous and unassuming. I thought about the bank, the folder, the key, the years I didn't know, and the years I was given afterward. I thought about how love had survived truth, and how truth had deepened love. If there is one lesson my life insists on leaving behind, it is this. Secrets may shape a life, but they do not have to define its ending. Understanding can come late and still arrive in time to matter. Forgiveness does not erase the past, it redeems the future. I loved my husband. I loved him before I knew everything. I loved him after I knew more. And in the space between those two loves, I found myself awake, honest, unafraid. That is where my story rests now, not in the shock, not in the secret, but in the quiet courage of opening the door, stepping forward, and choosing to live fully once the truth finally came into the light.